You would never say it out loud, not at brunch with friends, not even in bed with your partner. But deep down, a part of you has imagined it, being used, not loved, not cherished, used, not as a person, but as a body, an object, a thing. It sounds wrong, immoral, disturbing even. Why would anyone fantasize about being degraded, controlled, turned into a tool for someone else's pleasure? But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many do, and it doesn't mean they're damaged. It means they're human. You see, fantasies don't follow logic. They don't obey the rules of self-respect or social virtue. They speak a different language, one of contradiction, metaphor, and paradox. And sometimes, the deepest desire wears the mask of humiliation. To understand this fantasy, you have to stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "What does this mean?" Because being used isn't always about pain. It can be about relief, escape, surrender. In a world that constantly demands you to be responsible, controlled, kind, polite, being objectified can feel like liberation. For once, you're not the one performing. You're not trying to impress, to achieve, to care for anyone. You're not even a self. You're just a vessel for desire. And sometimes, that's the very thing the soul craves. This fantasy often shows up in people who feel emotionally overextended. The givers, the empaths, the perfectionists. The ones who are always carrying the emotional weight in relationships. They fantasize about being used, not because they want to be hurt, but because they want, for once, to stop being in charge, to dissolve, to disappear. There's also something profoundly erotic about powerlessness, when it's chosen, not because you're weak, but because in surrender, there's a kind of strength to say, "Take me, use me. I give myself to this moment, fully." That's not passive, that's radical. We imagine being used in part because it's a form of ego death, the voice in your head that says, "You're not enough, you're too much, you should be better." All of it fades, even if briefly, and in its place is pure sensation, pure presence. But this isn't just about control. Sometimes, people fantasize about being used as a way of reclaiming trauma. If you were once made to feel worthless, unwanted, or powerless, choosing to fantasize about being treated that way on your own terms can feel like a twisted form of healing. It's the mind's attempt to rewrite the story, to take back agency through imagination. Of course, this is dangerous territory. We're not saying pain is pleasure, or that abuse is erotic. We're saying that the mind and body are complex, that sometimes what arouses us isn't what aligns with our values, and that's okay. Desire is not a political statement. It's not a moral compass. It's a mirror, and often a cracked one. And in that mirror, what we see isn't always pretty, but it's honest. So the next time you find yourself haunted by a fantasy you shouldn't have, remember this. You're not broken. You're revealing. Desire tells stories that words cannot, and some of those stories involve being used, because somewhere inside you, there's a longing to let go. To be wanted, yes, but also to be consumed. To feel like someone else's hunger is bigger than your boundaries. Why? Because that hunger, raw, unfiltered, dangerous, makes you feel real. It reminds you that beneath the masks you wear every day, you are not just a mind, you are a body. And sometimes, being used is not about losing dignity. It's about shedding the illusion that you ever had to earn it. Desire lives in contradiction. What turns us on is rarely pure, and even more rarely noble. We like what we shouldn't, want what hurts, crave what degrades us, and yet, we return to it, again and again. Why? Because the erotic is not just about pleasure, it's about intensity, transcendence, disruption. Being used in a fantasy isn't about literal harm, it's about psychological release from the weight of identity, goodness, and control. Nietzsche once wrote, "Man is something that shall be overcome." In fantasy, that's exactly what we do. We overcome the self we have to be in the real world, polite, balanced, rational, and become something else entirely, something primal, something surrendered. Something surrendered, to be used, is to become the object of someone else's desire. And in that objectification, paradoxically, some find a strange form of empowerment. It's not always about inferiority, it's about being desired so intensely, so irrationally, that your humanity dissolves, and all that's left is raw want. That fantasy, to some, is intoxicating, especially for those whose daily lives revolve around being useful, caretakers, leaders, empaths, people who always feel they must earn love through service. Fantasizing about being used flips the script. Now, you're not giving anything. You're being taken, not because you've proven your worth, but because your very existence is worthy of consumption. It's disturbing, yes, but also revealing. Philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote, "To be wanted, to be taken, to be used, in fantasy, is to be freed from the burden of having to justify one's presence." That's the heart of it. In a world obsessed with merit, where every aspect of our identity must be polished and presented, some of us crave the opposite, to be stripped of all pretense, to be wanted not despite our flaws, but because we no longer have to hide them. In this way, the fantasy is existential. It isn't about sex, it's about selfhood. Who are you when you no longer need to be good? When you no longer need to be anything? Sometimes, being used is not a sign of low self-worth. It's a desire to abandon the exhausting performance of always being in control. Because power, as Michel Foucault reminds us, is everywhere, not just in politics, but in relationships, in desire, in identity. And the fantasy of being used is often a fantasy of redistributing that power, letting go, being taken, being remade in the image of someone else's lust. It's not that people want to be hurt, it's that they want to stop pretending they're not already carrying pain. And in fantasy, you can give that pain form. You can shape it, name it, play with it. For some, that's healing. We all seek catharsis. Some find it in meditation, others in rage. But for many, the most honest release happens in the imagined surrender of the self. And yes, it can be dangerous. Not because the fantasy is wrong, but because we often don't talk about it. We shame it, suppress it, treat it as deviance instead of data. But desire is a kind of truth-telling. As Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Fantasies, especially the uncomfortable ones, are part of that unconscious. They don't define who you are, but they reveal the forces inside you, the ones you've spent a lifetime trying to tame. And if you look closely, they often point to unmet needs. The need to be seen without performance, the need to be wanted without effort, the need to feel alive through intensity. So, the next time this fantasy visits you, don't judge it. Listen to it. It may not be asking for action. It may be asking for attention. Because sometimes, the parts of us that want to be used are the parts that just want to be held. Not all fantasies are meant to be lived. Some exist to remind us who we are when no one is watching. Others, who we might become if all rules collapsed. The fantasy of being used, at its core, is about permission. Permission to stop caring, to stop pleasing, to stop performing decency, maturity, and emotional control. And in its extreme, it's a hunger for chaos. Why? Because chaos feels like freedom when your life has been a prison of perfection. When you've spent years trying to be the better partner, the more mature friend, the reliable child. There's something darkly liberating in imagining a world where none of that matters, where you are reduced to flesh and want, where your humanity becomes irrelevant and your desire becomes everything. For many, this is horrifying, but for others, it's the most honest place they've ever visited. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek once said, "We feel free because we lack the very language to articulate our unfreedom." That's what fantasies can do. They give shape to the things we cannot say out loud. In reality, being used is a violation, but in fantasy, it's often the opposite, a deep surrender to one's own yearning. But make no mistake, not all fantasies are rooted in trauma. Some are born from the simple, raw desire to feel something beyond numbness. We live in a world that praises control, self-regulation, discipline. You're told to be thoughtful, mindful, aware of boundaries, considerate of others' needs. But desire doesn't care about that. Desire is selfish, it's unfiltered, and sometimes the deepest part of you wants to be desired in return, not for your kindness, your intelligence, or your inner beauty, but for your body, your rawness, your animal self. That's why, in these fantasies, there's no small talk, no connection building, no polite pauses, just hunger. And that hunger can feel truer than any relationship you've ever had. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed that human sexuality is a powerful force that distorts reason and enslaves us. But perhaps the reverse is also true. Fantasy liberates us from that enslavement by creating a safe container for the madness we can't allow ourselves to show in the daylight. Because sometimes, being used is code for being seen, not as a polished, social self, but as the unfiltered soul beneath it all. Still, fantasies are not innocent. They mirror the culture we swim in. When people raised to be submissive fantasize about being used, it can reflect internalized powerlessness. When people raised to be dominant crave being used, it can reflect a desire to collapse their own authority. So what do we do with all this? Do we act on it? Do we confess it? Or do we bury it deep enough to forget? The truth is, you don't have to do anything, because fantasies aren't moral statements. They are emotional maps. They point to needs, to hungers, to suppressed parts of your psyche, waiting for acknowledgement. A fantasy can tell you, I'm tired of being in control. I want to feel wanted. I don't want to be responsible. Just this once. I wish someone would see me and not expect me to explain. And that's not evil. That's human. As psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott said, it is a joy to be hidden, and a disaster not to be found. Fantasies are where we hide, but they're also where we beg to be found. So, whether your mind whispers of domination, submission, being used, being broken, or breaking others, remember, this isn't who you are. It's who you could be in another reality. The beauty is, you don't need to escape into that reality. You just need to understand why it calls to you. And sometimes, understanding is enough.